All right, welcome to everybody. I think we're about ready to go. So, hello and welcome to the first event in the Arts and Sciences lecture series sponsored by the American Hungarian Foundation. I'm organizing these to honor the memory of Dr. August Molnar, founder of the American Hungarian Foundation, and its longtime executive director and president. I need to let you know this is being recorded for internet purposes, so please shut off your video and audio for the duration of the talk. It is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce you to today's speaker, Dr. Oliver Botar. Dr. Botar received his PhD in art history from the University of Toronto and now teaches 20th century art history at the University of Manitoba. He is a past president of the Hungarian Studies Association of Canada and is the current curator of the Shalgo Trust for Education in New York. Dr. Botar specializes in early to mid 20th century art, architecture, photography, and media art, with emphasis on the Hungarian avant-garde, as well as on the intersection of biocentrism and modernism, and the art and ideas of Laszlo Molholy-Nagy. He has lectured and curated exhibits in the United States, Canada, Europe, and Japan. He has won numerous honors and awards, including for one of his recent books entitled Sensing the Future, Moholy-Nagy, Media and the Arts, published in Zurich by Lars Müller in 2014, which accompanied an exhibition in Winnipeg and Berlin. He was invited to contribute many lectures and articles in 2019, the centennial year of the founding of the Bauhaus, and in 2020, curated the major exhibition Bauhaus Canada 101 at the University of Manitoba School of Art Gallery. All told, Dr. Botar's scholarly monographs, anthologies, exhibition catalogs, journal articles, keynote addresses, conference papers, curatorial and other professional activities fill a CV comprising an amazing 52 pages. Dr. Botar is going to talk to us today about one of the major artists of the 20th century, Laszlo Molholy-Nagy, who was born in Hungary and lived from 1895 to 1946. He experimented in photography, painting, sculpture, even film, working with the director Alexander Korda. Molholy-Nagy taught at the Bauhaus early in his career, then in the late 1930s became director of the new Bauhaus in Chicago, soon called the School of Design, then the Institute of Design, and now part of the Illinois Institute of Technology. It is very fitting to the mission of the American Hungarian Foundation to launch this lecture series with such a distinguished scholar as is Oliver Botar, who will speak on a modern figure who links Hungary and the United States. The title of his talk is Moholy-Nagy, an Education of the Senses. And those of you in the audience, please feel free to type in your questions in the chat. Dr. Botar?
Thank you, Anne. I'm going to share the screen here. All right. Hello, everybody. As you've heard, my name is Oliver Botar, and I'm speaking to you from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory in the province of Manitoba in Canada. This is the homeland of the Métis Nation and the lands also of the Anishinaabe, the Lakota, the Cree, the Oji-Cree people who've been living here for a very long time. So I wanted to acknowledge that. So my talk, as you've heard, thank you for that introduction, Anne, is Moholy-Nagy, an Education of the Senses. Let me just hide something here for myself. There we go. So I'm going to start with a quotation. The vast development both of technology and of the big cities have increased the capacity of our perceptual organs for simultaneous acoustical and optical activity. Everyday life itself affords examples of this. Berliners cross the Potsdamer Platz. They're talking, they hear simultaneously. The horns of the motor cars, the bells of the trams, the honking of the buses, the hollering of the coachman, the roar of the subway, the shouts of the newspaper boys, the sounds of a loudspeaker, and so on, and can differentiate these acoustical impressions. Whereas a rural person, recently found quite disoriented in this Platz, was so greatly confused by the number of impressions that he stood as though rooted to the spot before an oncoming tram. It's obviously possible to construct an analogous situation with optical experiences. Analogous also that modern optics and acoustics employed as means of artistic creation can be accepted by and can enrich only those who are receptive to the times in which they live. And this is a quotation from Moholy-Nagy's first book, Painting, Photography, Film, that was published in 1924 and went into another edition, 1925, and went into another edition. Laszlo Molholy-Nagy was born in Bács-Borsod in southern Hungary in 1895, educated in the city of Szeged in what is now southern Hungary, and died in Chicago in 1946. He is considered to be one of the most important progenitors of what is now referred to media art. This talk is based on a project I undertook in the mid-2000s, one that I finally realized as the exhibition and book and Sensing the Future, Moholy-Nagy Media and the Arts. And the exhibition was shown first at Plug-in Institute of Contemporary Art here in Winnipeg, and then it traveled to the Bauhausarchiv, Museum für Gestaltung, Museum for Design in Berlin. What you will hear today takes the last talk I held here is what you hear today is based on this exhibition project and book project. Even more importantly than his importance for the development of art and new media, Moholy-Nagy made it his lifetime goal to educate people how to both adapt to and learn from the intensified sensory inputs of modernity. This talk explores the ways in which he prioritized pedagogy, particularly the rediscovery of our sensorium, the education of the senses, as he put it, in his practice. In my work, through archival research and a rereading of his work as a result of the results of such research, I've sought to complicate the standard art historical narrative of constructivism in general and of Moholy-Nagy in specific. So what I'm about to tell you is controversial within the field of art history, according to which Moholy was seen as being a technophilic person, period. Inasmuch as he was recognized as having a utopian concern with the development of the individual, this recognition was attributed to general humanism. I've tried to both understand his message and specify its origins. And I think he complicated humanism and he went beyond that, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. I should note here that Moholy-Nagy was not a systematic thinker, so a certain degree of contradiction in his thinking is inevitable. Oh, and yeah. And this, I should mention that this photograph is Moholy-Nagy as the probably undergoing a particular type of body therapy, awareness of a sensual therapy or sense therapy in the late 1920s. Here's another quotation. The body of a person is a synthesis of all his functional apparatuses. The human of any given period is most complete when the functional apparatuses of which he is composed, the cells as much as the most complex organs, are being used to the limit of their biological capacity. Not the individual's occupation, nor the object to be manufactured will be foregrounded, but rather the organic functions of man should be recognized. With this functional preparation, he can then pass on to action, to a life grounded from within. This is how we realize the organic basis for production, the focal point of which is man rather than profit interests. So this is Moholy-Nagy in 1922. It is because he believed that our senses, our functional apparatuses, as he put it, need to be trained, that it was a fully reformed pedagogy that was at the center of Moholy-Nagy's interest, rather than art making. In fact, he saw the artworks he produced as aspects, if not byproducts, of his larger pedagogical project, educating people to be able to use their sensory apparatus to its fullest extent, educating people indeed to expand their senses in accordance with the proliferation of media technologies. Moholy's view, such a sensory education would assist people in successfully adapting to our increasingly technologized, mediatized, and image-saturated environment, rather than succumbing to it, as the techno-pessimistic anti-modernists of his own time, such as the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, held. The futurists had already proposed that artists learn from the so-called simultaneity of modern life, but they placed art making rather than pedagogy at the center of their attention. Ever the optimist, as if anticipating German media theorist Friedrich Kittler's Heideggerian dictum that, quote, "It is we who adapt to the machine does not adapt to us," Moholy-Nagy attempted to place humanity back in control in light of this disheartening trajectory of modernity. In an age of even more intensive accelerated technological medial change, Moholy-Nagy's message is all the more important today. And this is one of the reasons that I really focused on this aspect of his work, because I actually think that he has things to tell us that are relevant today. In achieving his goal of sensory education, he advocated the use of all potential media in making art without privileging one over the other. This rejection of a medial hierarchy legitimized his employment of various media in his creative production. He did not wish to privilege new media over old, high art over low. Rather, he wished to make people, or even art over design, things made by hand. Rather, he wished to make people aware of the possibilities of all media, new and old, of all culture, high and low, of fine art as well as applied art, and to exploit their potentialities to their fullest in achieving his goal of integrated human beings who could comfortably live within modernity, or rather, who could, together with their fully functioning bodies and fully discovered and used sensoria, build a better, from his point of view, a post-capitalist, a socialist society. His experimental and embracing approach to media and materials, his interdisciplinarity, intermediality, his resistance to a hierarchy of high and low in visual culture, his concern with perception, and his attitude towards art as information anticipated some of the artistic approaches now current. So, a little bit of biography of background. Moholy-Nagy moved to Budapest to study law in 1913 and was drafted into the Austro-Hungarian army by 1915. He was injured several times in the Great War, and he experienced firsthand the sensory overload in the worst sense of modernity. He was actually, like many people of his generation, he was traumatized by the Great War, but unlike many of the artists who experienced the Great War, he never really focused on that aspect of it in his art. Having had literary ambitions in his youth, in Budapest, he became involved with avant-garde cultural circles, particularly with the activist group around Lajos Kossuth, and like many young people in his day, he was enthusiastic about the Hungarian Soviet Republic of 1919. When it collapsed in August of that year, he returned to Szeged to be with his friends, but after a few months left for Vienna, whence in early 1920, he settled in Berlin. His experience of the war, of the Budapest avant-garde, and of the Hungarian Soviet were definitive for him. He felt that the collapse of the Soviet Republic was in part due to the people who made it up not being themselves prepared for the construction of a new, more just society. But Budapest intellectual circles, Kossuth's activist movement, and the Hungarian Soviet Republic also made him aware of the plethora of utopian ideas on the intellectual menu on the one hand, and the role that public education and artistic activity could take in trying to realize them on the other. Because the Soviet Republic in Budapest and Hungary at the time, while it was really a failure in many, many ways, it was also a really fascinating experiment in social engineering. And it's astonishing what they achieved in 133 days. Literally millions of flyers, posters, books were published, universities were reformed. Every evening, famous actors would read bedtime stories to working class children in public parks. It was really, in many ways, a remarkable experiment. It is within the early 20th century German life reform movement, and particularly within the German women's communes of the 1920s, to which Moholy-Nagy's first wife, Lucia Schulz, introduced him, that many of his ideas on sensory discovery and education were formulated. Activists within this movement, such as Elizabeth Vogler and Marie Buchholz, made him aware of the pedagogical reform movement, which sought to create better, more fully integrated people who could then participate in the construction of a better, more fully functional society. So in a very real way, Moholy-Nagy was inspired by early 20th century feminism. And this is a subject which I've treated in another talk, which really needs further research and publication. And I should just mention that he met Lucia Schulz in Berlin shortly after his arrival in 1920, and they married early in 1921. Writing on vacation near the women's communes during the summer of 1924, Moholy-Nagy asked a series of questions such as, why must art appeal only to the senses of sight and sound? Why not also to the senses of smell and touch, or the bodily senses of kinesthetics and proprioception? Why must the one who experiences art always be on its outside, on its exterior? Why can't works of art be immersive and participatory? Why not employ technical devices such as telescopes and microscopes and X-rays machines for the production of art? He articulated these questions in a series of articles published in 1922 and 1923 in journals such as the Hungarian exile journal Ma, being published in Vienna at that time, Der Sturm, being published in Berlin, and the Dutch avant-garde journal De Stijl, which is being published in Utrecht in the Netherlands. These articles constitute an ars poetica that would serve him for the remainder of his career. He published these ideas in his first book, Painting, Photography, Film, in 1925, which I've mentioned to you before. As a result of his experience with what the Germans call Reformpädagogie, or pedagogical reform, Moholy-Nagy's worldview became rooted in what was then termed biocentric notions of humanity as an integral part of nature. For this reason, there is this decidedly ecological aspect to his work, which makes it all the more relevant today. And I don't have time now to speak about biocentrism in detail, but it's been a focus of my research on Moholy-Nagy. And that was a neo-romantic, a revival of neo-romantic ideas in the late 19th century and of humanity's place in nature. So kind of placing nature at the center rather than, so kind of an anti-anthropocentric view of the world rather than the anthropocentric worldview, which was typical of European culture since the Renaissance, and particularly since the Enlightenment of the 18th century. Writing on, next slide. As a result of this newfound awareness, Moholy-Nagy changed the terms of reference with respect to the production of art in general, and he engaged in a deep critique of artistic production in relation to new technologies. Unlike many other artists of his generation, Moholy-Nagy did not merely promote the positions that art itself must be renewed, that art must be part of the attempt to renew society, or that art must resist the technologization and therefore dehumanization of society. Instead, his position was essentially a pedagogical one. Yes, the world is rapidly becoming more technologized, but this process is not necessarily a bad thing. The task of the artist and the art teacher is to help people not only to come to terms with, but to actually take control of the technologies entering their lives through the production of art employing these technologies. Following the early 20th century Austro-Hungarian biophilosopher Raoul Heinrich Franze, Moholy-Nagy saw the intensification of technological change as a fully natural process with the capacity to more fully realize everyone's unique human potential. Yes, the world's economic and social systems are unjust and changes are necessary, but revolution, political revolution by itself is insufficient. People need to be able to use all their sensory organs to their fullest capacity. In other words, they must perfect themselves in order to achieve utopian goals. And this is a very utopian idea. The primary goal of both artists and educators, he held, was to teach people to first discover and then make fuller use of their inborn senses. Technology could aid in realizing the sensory education by helping us see the world in new, more exact ways on the one hand, and on training us to actually develop or expand our sensory capabilities on the other. Moholy-Nagy's biopolitical stance placed him in opposition to more orthodox communist political activities. So here are just a couple of quotations from later in his life, because he maintained this position throughout his life. Technology is today as much a part of life as metabolism. It's pretty radical. Or in spite of the rebellion against the machine, technical progress is a factor of life which develops organically. Notwithstanding its manifold distortion by profit interests, we can no longer think of life without such progress. It is an indispensable factor in raising the standard of life. And he wrote that just before his untimely death from leukemia. And he got these ideas about technology being a fully natural process from Raoul Heinrich Franze. This did not mean it was an uncritical acceptance of all technology. It was just an acknowledgement that because humans themselves are an integral part of technology, everything humans do and create is also a part of technology. And Franze further held that all human technology is rooted in non-human natural technology. Let's say slide here. Called by the German architect Walter Gropius to teach at the famous design school, the Bauhaus, in 1923, where he headed the metal workshop and taught the introductory course, he encouraged the students to discover their own sensory capabilities. For example, to produce touch charts. Here we go. This is where I should be. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself here. I wanted to show you this slide where you can see the ubiquity of the hand in his imagery, in his filmmaking, and so on. And that's really just emphasizing the sense of touch, the haptic sense. And here he is, a young professor at the metal workshop at the Bauhaus in Weimar in 1924. And here is a touch chart made by one of his students, the Croatian-Hungarian later great textile artist, Otti Berger at the right, unfortunately a victim later on of the Holocaust. He did not neglect the visual sense. In his program for New Vision, he proposed that photographers learn from applied photography that expanded our vision through mechanical means. Here we see examples of applied photographs made using microscopic, telescopic, X-ray, and high-speed imaging technology. So he actually called on artists to look not at fine art photography, but at applied photography, because he felt that applied photography was somehow, was more honest in a way, was more true to the technological capabilities of the photographic apparatus. The camera could also be aimed in unexpected ways, at unexpected surfaces, at unusual angles in order to challenge our sense of sight and our conventional understanding of our environment. In other words, he attempted to use the camera to make the familiar unfamiliar, of Ostramieni as the as some Russian philosophers proposed, of making strange. True awareness is awakened in us by what is unfamiliar. So if you make the everyday world, if you look at it from unfamiliar angles, then you'll look at it in a new way, and you'll understand it perhaps in a new way. And this is aesthetic of the unexpected, of defamiliarization, could also be applied to film, which, with its added dimension of time, of dynamism, could be even more challenging to our habitual ways of seeing. And I'm showing you stills here from several of his films. I call this his Metropolitan Trilogy: The Old Port of Marseille, Berlin Still Lifes, and Metropolitan Gypsies, I think, which is his most beautiful film, which was made about the Roma and Sinti groups just living on the outskirts of Berlin in the early 30s, and who 10 years later would fall victim to the racial policies of the National Socialists and would end up mostly perishing in the Holocaust. It's actually a very important document. Inspired by his friend, the Austrian Dadaist living in Berlin, Raoul Hausmann, and by his Hungarian friend and former classmate in law school, Alfred Kemény, Moholy-Nagy went even further, envisioning a participatory art of total bodily immersion and movement. This was highly unusual at the time and anticipated a host of aesthetic approaches that were only realized by others in the 1960s, and which have since that time become pretty well standard for many, many artists. The proposal for what he called the kinetic constructive system, a kind of fairground ride or play structure for adults, was his most radical proposal in this regard. And if you look at the image on the right, the design on the right, which was drawn by a studio assistant of his, a Hungarian architect by the name of István Sebek, it's a little bit hard to read, but what it was a proposal for a 12-story spiral tower, which itself spun around and which had these very precipitous ramps within it, spiral ramps that people could go sliding down. And there was also a fireman's pole which people could slide down. So it was a way of kind of making people aware of their bodily capabilities and heightening their sensory capabilities as well. This idea of immersion was perhaps most intensively expressed in his work as a cinematographer for the film Big City Gypsies, in which he celebrated Roma life and humanized the Roma and Sinti living on the outskirts of Berlin. In one scene of a big party, he hoisted the newly available portable film camera on his shoulders, crouched down, and moved with a dancing crowd while he filmed, spinning the camera with them as they danced around him. By doing this, he stimulated our sympathetic senses of kinesthesia and proprioception, and incorporated a sense of immersion and participation. The immersion and participation he himself experienced while filming into the viewers of the film. This is a technique later taken up by other filmmakers that is quite common today. You can see it in all kinds of TV shows and films. In his polycinema proposal, Moholy proposed the use of simultaneous multiple projections of films as means to stimulate our intense experiences of modernity, challenging our sensory capacities just as modern life did. So if you look down at the lower right at this schematic diagram, this was his attempt to suggest the simultaneous projection of 3 films within one concave space. But he also proposed that not only that there be 3 or more, didn't really matter how many, film projections at one time within a space within which also the viewership would be at the center of the space, but also that the film projectors themselves should pivot. So this would have created a very dynamic environment of multiple projections, of multiple kinetic projections, of films which would have been connected to each other as well. it was really a new way of thinking about the medium of film. So while he was not himself able to realize a polycinema, he did employ multiple projections in his designs for theatrical and operatic productions of the late 1920s. And he actually produced these set designs and these production designs for operas such as The Tales of Hoffmann in 1929, but also for Puccini's Madame Butterfly. These were truly radical designs for opera, and they were very controversial at the time. They were roundly attacked in the conservative press, but they were also highly successful. His theater, or his my cat just attacked me. His operatic production for The Tales of Hoffmann and for Madame Butterfly went through many performances. And I and my colleagues in the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Manitoba, we got a grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, a research creation grant, in order to collaborate to try and realize a version of this dream of a polycinema. So I worked with two colleagues, Patrick Herrick and Lancelot Kaur, who, along with their graduate student, Chris Burke, and myself, we did realize this polycinema at the Berlin showing of the exhibition, Sensing the Future. And you can get a sense here of the multiple projections of both light and film within a wonderful kind of projection space that you could walk into that was developed by Lancelot Kaur. Encouraged by Walter Gropius, the founding director of the Bauhaus, in 1937, at the invitation of Walter Pepke, the chairman of the Container Corporation of America, Moholy-Nagy moved to Chicago to become the director of the new Bauhaus, an institution funded by a group of American industrialists, looking to found a school that would train students to design for industrial production in the United States. There, Moholy-Nagy not only continued its program of an education towards the rediscovery of our senses, he elaborated on it. He reinforced his earlier rhetoric on technology as being a quote-unquote natural aspect of our lives, and hence something to be utilized in the production of art. His discovery of America involved a steep learning curve, however. The school lost the financial backing of its supporters after only a single academic year because the industrialists did not see the sense in teaching abstractions rather than practical skills. So the way he taught his students was to explore materials, to explore colors at a very basic level, to kind of go back to square one, or go back to their childhoods in a sense, in approaching material, color, and form. They didn't see the value in this. They wanted results that were immediately applicable to industry, by designing, I don't know, telephones and motor cars and whatever. And so they pulled their funding. But Moholy-Nagy was quite a stubborn man, and he reestablished the school immediately as the School of Design, later the Institute of Design, which eventually became part of the Illinois Institute of Technology, and is still in one form or another a part of the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. So his first school, the new Bauhaus, closed in 1938, but Walter Pepke continued his support, and so in 1939 he was able to reopen his school. In 1942, the United States entered the war, and by that year, Moholy-Nagy was involved with research and teaching aimed at perceptual aspects of the war effort, such as camouflage and the rehabilitation of wounded veterans, particularly those with sensory impairment. This was a question that Moholy-Nagy attacked with enthusiasm in an article of the period. Based on his extensive thinking on this issue, he raised important questions concerning ability, disability, and our sensory functioning and rehabilitation of injured and otherwise abled persons through art geared towards their changed or different sensoria. So again, this was really a pioneering work where he focused on, he basically took the position that our sensory capabilities are, in a sense, not so much arbitrary as specific to our species. Different species have different sensory capabilities. They evolved with different sensory capabilities, different abilities to see, different spectra of the electromagnetic spectrum, different other senses which we don't have, such as I don't know, the ability to sense the magnetic fields of the earth that birds have, for example. He recognized that not only are there sensory differences between species, but there are sensory differences between individuals, and that each individual sensorium is possible to be, it's possible to educate each individual sensorium in a way that works for that person, and that artists should also gear themselves not only towards the mainstream senses, but also alternative forms of perception. He instructed his students to make what he called sculptures for the blind, for example, artworks made especially for the sense of touch. So these objects were meant to be picked up and touched and felt. And if you were a sighted person, you would close your eyes while you experience these. They were not meant to be looked at, even though they are beautiful objects. And if you were an unsighted person or a person with visual impairment, it was really geared towards you. Sight impaired people, of course, employ their haptic sense far more than sighted people do, but works could also be fully experienced by sighted people as well. Building on the ideas put forward in the proposal for the mechanical eccentric, this was an idea for a kind of multisensory theatrical experience. It's kind of hard to read this score, I would call it, at the left-hand side of your screen. But there's a column for the visual aspects of the spectacle, a column for the oral aspects. There was to be a sound dimension here, a color dimension, and even a scent dimension, where scents would have been released within the theater as this was being produced. And also there was to be a dancer on a stage and the projection of films during this multimedia production. So basing himself on these ideas, he encouraged his students in Chicago to produce devices for experiencing various scents. And you can see here at the lower right, designs by his student Charles Niedringhaus. In the second semester in 1938, he produced a smellometer where you could actually smell different types of senses that were contained within this box. Thank you very much for your attention. That is the end of my talk, and I would welcome questions. And you have to unmute yourself.
And you're muted. You're still muted.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just thinking that was really a great, very informative and interesting talk. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I wonder if you could say a little bit about, you could put yourself in the head of Moholy-Nagy and talk about what he might think of things going on in today's world, the say the technical progress since he was here, how biocentrism might fit in with the contemporary political movements. We've had movements giving a voice to underrepresented populations. And I just wonder how he would interpret biocentrism in today's world.
It's a great question. Of course, this is always going to be speculation. It's really sad that he died at the age of 51, not only because he had two young daughters, but because, he anticipated so many post-war ideas in his work. And I think that it would have been really interesting to see how he reacted to some of these developments. We know, for example, that shortly before he died, when he was already in hospital with leukemia being treated, he was appalled by the detonation of the bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He actually made paintings about that. He really was determined to be a part of the attempt to defeat the National Socialists. That was very clear. He himself was of Jewish heritage. It was particularly important to him. But he was also appalled at the way that technology could be used for destruction as well as for, more positive purposes. Your question is multidimensional. I didn't get a chance to talk about a number of things. For example, his concept of art as information. He was a pioneer of the idea of art as information, of a kind of proto-digitization of art. He actually made some objects in 1922-23 they're called the telephone pictures often, because what he did is that he took graph paper and he specified according to this grid which squares in the grid should be which colors, and he took these instructions to a sign making workshop, an enamel sign making workshops, the way that old Coke signs used to be made for stores. And with standardized colors, he ordered from the sign making workshop what he called paintings. And people could order these paintings, in theory, in whatever dimensions they wanted. And if they wanted, he would offer them different designs. So this is kind of proto-digital, especially this is an idea of Eduardo Katz, an artist who teaches at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and who's very prominent in new media art even today. So he, in a way, foresaw or anticipated, let's just say, digital technology. He was also fascinated with the idea of translating art into light, and especially light into sound and sound into light. So these are all kind of anticipatory of digital technologies. I think he would have been really thrilled at the development of computer art in the 1950s. And in fact, people such as Nicholas Schoeffer, his own student and his studio assistant, György Kepes, themselves carried on these ideas during the 50s and the 60s and created works using, for example, computer technology. So I think he would have been really pleased with a lot of the developments in art, the immersive participatory developments in art that came later on in the 60s, the 70s, and onwards. As far as biocentrism goes, I think he would have been really surprised at the notion that many people have, that environmentalism was somehow a development of the early 1960s after Rachel Carson published her book Silent Spring, because these ideas were very widespread in Central Europe in the early to mid 20th century. The ideas, though, were taken up to some extent by some Nazis who were biocentric. And so this discredited these ideas to some extent. But he certainly would have been, I think, gratified by the rise of the environmental movement. And I think he also would have been pleased at the kind of anti-anthropocentric notions of the current environmentalist movement as it's developed. But I think that he would have been appalled at the extent to which we have allowed these digital technologies, these computer technologies, to rule our lives. because that really was a central message, that we have to take control of these technologies. We must not allow these technologies to take control of us. Because of his enthusiasm for new technology and his exhortation to artists to adopt new technologies, no matter what they were. They didn't necessarily have to be technologies aimed at artists, any technology. To use these, to adapt these technologies to art making in order to, in a sense, humanize them or to make them more accessible to the average person. He would have been appalled, I think, at the extent to which we've allowed these technologies to take over our lives. I think he would have been happy about the ways that artists have wholeheartedly adopted all these technologies. But, you know, I think he would have been upset about at the extent to which we've allowed these technologies to rule our lives now. And, but, you know, in a sense, this was also the case in the 1920s, which was also a period of intense technological change. So, you know, the more things change, the more things stay the same to a certain extent. I don't know if that answers your question.
That was a really interesting answer to the question. Thank you very much. If there aren't any other comments right now, we're coming to the end of our time. And I would like to thank the American-Hungarian Foundation for sponsoring this event. Melissa Kotko-Pepin of the Foundation for her help with publicity and setup, and technical advisor Christina Congela. And I especially want to thank our speaker, Oliver Botar, for his excellent presentation. And thank you to the audience for coming to listen. Those of you who want to see it again, it will eventually be archived on the Foundation website and available through YouTube.
Thank you for the invitation to speak.
Thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Oliver, that was wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.